They said, we want her to like you. So we think you're going to be seeing her again. So she really likes apples. So here, give her these apples. So I said, okay. I take the bucket, and I said, what do I do? And they said, go walk up to her. So I go, I'm standing in front of Tus, and she's 2 meters high, and she's looking at me. I said, what do I do now? And they say trunk up. So I go, Tus, trunk up. So she raises up her trunk, and that opens her mouth, just like this. So now I'm standing in front of this giant open mouth, and I say, what do I do now? And they say, just throw in the apples. So I start throwing in the apples. It's like throwing them into a dumpster, right? So and then after a while, she starts chewing, and then her mouth is open again, and I empty the pail, and I say, okay, I'm done now. And they say, just walk back to the wall. And I walk back to the wall. They take the bucket, and they say, now walk slowly to the side and go. So I did that. And then I go back with the vets, and we develop the films, and sure enough, this is the x-ray. And you can see, this is the distal tuft, and it's cracked. And these are needles that they had put in. They were pulling out pus from the cracked nail for culture. But this is periosteal reaction. It's osteo. So now, this is a problem. Because osteo we treat with IV antibiotics. But Tus has elephant skin. And on top of that, if you start an IV and you infuse whatever it is, she's going to roll around and knock it out, which means that you're going to have to go in once or twice a day and start a new IV on her for weeks. She'll go crazy one day. And then, so the vets had this big deliberation, and they decided they were going to treat her with Bactrim. Trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, orally. So I asked them, I said, how do you dose this? And they said, no problem, we do it by weight. 250,000 milligrams twice a day. That's 500 tablets. And what they did was they took a wheelbarrow, they counted 500 tablets into a wheelbarrow, they bring it up to Tus and say, Tus, eat. And she would eat 500 tablets of trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole. And then after 6 weeks, we x-rayed her again. That's the repeat. And after like 4 weeks, she was already bearing weight. So it cured. It worked. So we treated osteomyelitis in a foot of an elephant. Now what's interesting was that I would bring friends to the zoo periodically, and I would always bring them to the elephant house to tell them the story of Tus. As I get close to the gate, Tus would come to the gate. She remembered the apples. That lasted for about 5 years. After 5 years, she saw no more apples were coming, and she decided I was just a one-night stand. Okay, so there are a lot of little species that we have at the zoo. The Rodriguez fruit bat is one of them. And one day, one of the Rodriguez fruit bats had this swelling. And here's the radiograph. And if you look at the tibia, you can see he's got a mass over here. So, this is really bad news because they're so small that just from a biopsy, you end up destroying the bone, and it doesn't heal well. So the animal had to be euthanized. But the fear was that it was something bad, infectious. Or if it's a tumor, that it's some tumor that's genetically mediated and there's a problem with the conservation pattern, but it was actually an aneurysmal bone cyst, and we couldn't find an underlying lesion. So as best as I'm aware, it's the only aneurysmal bone cyst in a Rodriguez fruit bat. Now, these are guira cuckoos. These birds are, I was taught long ago that Americans are always very open, everything is even, and you always refer to people in very nice terms. These are stupid animals, really stupid animals. They'll fly into walls, but they breed like crazy. In the morning, there could be 30 newborn guira cuckoos. There was a problem. One day, there were guira cuckoos that were born and then were limping, broken legs, broken wings, and it hadn't been a problem. they had, so there had been some changes to the glass over the enclosure at the ceiling of the birdhouse, but nothing inside the birdhouse and no change in their diet. So here you can see, this is a fractured tibia. And here's another one. So, and the vets were fixing them. So this became, one vet became a full-time job. One vet was just fixing guira cuckoos. So they called in the PhD nutritionist. Smart lady. Now a lot of the issues are nutrition related, but she's a really smart lady, this lady. So she said that they're getting exactly what their same diet that they have in the wild. And they were like, this makes no sense, something here happened. And they said, we might be looking at a change. And the change is that the nutritional requirements might change in captivity compared to the wild. Because in the wild the animals are doing whatever, and in captivity they're doing less or different things. There's also the issue of the angle of the sun. The angle of the sunlight might affect the quality of the vitamin D that the animals are making, and so they might have osteomalacia. And so so this went to the curator of birds. So the chief veterinarian and the curator of birds decided that they would tear up the floor in the birdhouse and replace it with a high calcium substrate. But they bought a very custom high calcium substrate where the floor looked like it had little pebbles or seeds in it. So these birds, they're stupid birds, they'll go and they'll peck at the floor because they see these things that are really part of the flooring, but because they keep pecking at the floor, they're absorbing this high calcium substrate. The floor cost a fortune, but the fractures in the guira cuckoo stopped. So that was very telling, and we'll come back to that. The same concept continued. So this is a Humboldt penguin. This is a Humboldt penguin who ate too much of a good thing, and he got obstructed, and he had to be disimpacted. Now, this is an eider duck. Very pretty ducks. This was a this was a pretty big disaster. Here you can see X-rays and a CAT scan of pneumonia in a duck. Now, birds have. We'll come back to the penguin. Birds they have different air sacs. They have two lungs, but they also have dorsal and ventral air sacs. Those are non-respiratory. Those are really made for buoyancy and to make the shape and have large areas of the bird that are air weight. Well, come back to here, you can see this area is the lung. So if you ever have a bird that comes to visit you in the emergency room, this is what pneumonia looks like in a bird. This stuff down over here, these are the air sacs. That's non-respiratory. But what we did with this duck, since this duck was really sick, we brought this duck, and all the animals, when I do them in the hospital, I do them after midnight. We lock the area off, it's off limits, we bring the animal in through the back door, and afterwards we clean the entire room with 10% hypochlorite. So I'm scanning back then, I was, I was just a bone radiologist, so I would be everything. I'd be the tech, I'm housekeeping, whatever it is. I just wanted to do the animal cases. So I'm scanning the animal, and all of a sudden the vet starts screaming, "Stop the scan, stop the scan." So I stop the scan, and they run inside and they start coating the duck. And they're injecting all these meds, and they're performing CPR on the duck, and it didn't work. It was a dead duck. So, and they were all sad. Oh, the duck died. So I spread out the duck on the table. I scanned the duck, thin slices through the whole duck, And I asked the vet, the pathologist, since every animal is autopsied, any animal that dies at the zoo is autopsied, it doesn't matter from what, they want to make sure they know what it dies from. And that's how West Nile virus was discovered. It was uncovered by the pathologist at the Bronx Zoo who was autopsying dead crows, found at the zoo, and she found the virus, and the CDC said she was wrong, and they sent it to the laboratory in St. Louis, and the laboratory in St. Louis confirmed it, that she was right, and that was the uncovery of West Nile virus. But over here I said, we don't have a good atlas, cross-sectional atlas of a duck. So when you post this duck, slice the duck in slices that exactly match what I did on the CT. So we're going to have, at least in the axial plane, we're going to have an anatomic position. And a duck is standing up with both wings, so that I created my own anatomic position for a duck. And I said, slice it what I'll consider transverse, and then we'll have a pathology to CT correlation, which she did. And then off that, she did the pathology. She calls me up 2 days later and she said, it's as expected, the duck died of aspergillus, which is very, very common in birds. But I got worried, because aspergillus is very common in humans, and it's a pathogen in immunosuppressed people. I thought, oh my God. Now, if, let's say, somewhere in this hospital, some child who with leukemia or a bone transplant dies of aspergillus, some newspaper reporter get a hold of this and say, mad doctor infects and kills child. I said, okay, I need to report this to infection control. So I went to see the head of infection control, and I was sure that he would open up his book of the history of France and build a guillotine for me. So I went to see him, and I tell him what happened. He looks at me and says, let me understand this. You've been sneaking animals into the hospital and imaging them. Yeah. And then you snuck in an animal and it died. Yeah. And now you're coming to me. Yeah. And he's quiet for a while. And he goes, can I help? Like, what? And he said, I always wanted to be a vet. I applied to vet school for 5 years. I wanted to do small animals. I got rejected 5 years in a row. I finally gave up. I went to medical school. I did internal medicine. I did infectious disease. I'm now the head of infection control, but I really love animals. I said, wait right here. I'll be right back. I run outside his office. I call up the chief vet. I say, here's the guy's name. Here's his phone number. Call him up now and make him a consultant for the zoo. He said, who is he? What is he? I said, I'll tell you later. Just call him. Goodbye. And I stand outside the office. I hear the phone ring. I hear him mumbling. I hear him hang up the phone. I go back in. He goes, you're not going to believe it. The chief veterinarian of the zoo just called me and said that I could be a consultant. And I said, what do I have to do? And he said, I have to talk to you. And I said, yeah, here's the deal. I said, I've been approving these animals myself. I said, now it's two-way street. I'll approve the radiology stuff. You approve everything related to infection control. And you come up with our whatever protocol we need to clean. And we will follow whatever you do. And he said, no. I will take care of the cleaning. I will sleep in my office and I will clean the rooms. Wow. So he says, but we have one problem. I said, what's the problem? The problem is that it's against New York State law to bring pets into a hospital if they're not seeing eye dogs. I said, what are you going to do? He said, I don't know, but I'll speak to our health inspector. He comes to my office 2 days later. He said, okay, I spoke to the health department. I said, what happened? He goes, well, I told him the whole story, and the guy said, absolutely not. So he said, why not? He said, because you can't bring in pets. So this guy says, they're not pets. Nobody owns them. So the health inspector says, so what are they? He says, they're patients. There's no restriction in the health law about bringing in non-human patients. Turns out that was true. So we bring them in today under the fact that patients are not excluded. So I can't do your dog, but I can still do a whale. Okay. So here we have, this is another mallard who had pneumonia. And again, you can see the pneumonia over here. Pneumonia in birds is actually very common. Now, this is a bufflehead duck, and he swallowed a piece of fence. So here you can see this piece of fence that he swallowed. Now, what drove him to swallow this piece of fence, I'll never know. But they swallow all kinds of shiny things. So this one, they actually took out with a snare, and it was interesting watching them take it out. They snared the end, and then they held the duck in their hands while they were bending the neck around and bending the duck around and pulling it out. The duck was under anesthesia, so he wasn't trying to fight them. There's also an issue with some of these birds where they swallow coins. People throw coins in ponds and pools. They think it's very nice. Americans do this all the time. They see some collection of water, they start throwing money in. And the problem is the birds swallow that. And American money has high concentrations of both lead and zinc, both of which are toxic to birds. So at the zoo we've gotten a number of animals. If birds are brought in and their consciousness is a little altered, they right away get a radiograph to look for coins, and then if their coins are there, they're endoscoped or colonoscoped, depending on whatever's closest. The coins are pulled out and then they're treated with chelating agents. Now, these birds of paradise are absolutely beautiful birds. So this is a normal. This is a red-tailed bird of paradise, and the lungs are up over here. These are okay. This is not pneumonia. This is the heart, and this is the liver. This is another red-tailed bird of paradise. This is the heart, and this is the liver. So this animal has huge liver. So the vets had no idea. We had 7 animals like this. So they autopsied them, and they all had hemochromatosis. So how do you get hemochromatosis in birds of paradise? So once again, this was an emergency conference between the curator of birds and the vets. And it turns out these animals come from an area in Central Africa where there's very little iron. So it seems whatever little iron they get, they're extremely efficient at holding on to. And they get the iron from pecking at pieces of bone that were broken open by other animals, and from the little marrow that they absorb. That's it, that's enough iron for them. So what happened over here is that these animals, the hypothesis of the vets and curators was, by pecking at the stainless steel bars, these birds threw themselves into hemochromatosis from iron overload. And so the curator of birds ordered all metal to be removed from the birdhouses, to be replaced only with glass, plexiglass, or open spaces. The project cost several $1 million. They did it. No cases of hemochromatosis have recurred. So you're noticing the pattern. The pattern at the zoo is this. As soon as a problem is identified, usually based upon human experience, the zoo will spend whatever money is necessary to assure that that disorder is not replicated in wildlife. So what we say at the zoo is that we do not experiment on animals. We experiment on humans and take what we learned from humans to the treatment of wildlife. And politically it fits, and it's actually factual. We do not experiment on the wildlife at the zoo, absolutely not. This is a very pretty cheetah with a slip capital femoral epiphysis. Now, he was an adolescent male, but he wasn't overweight. So you can see, now, what happens to these animals is the keepers found him sitting under a tree. He was lying down under a tree, made himself a little hole, and he was just waiting to die. And so they darted him to put him to sleep, because even though he's waiting to die, he's not passive. Somebody gets close to him, they'll bite their arm off. So they dart him to put him to sleep, and then they pinned him, and then he woke up. He was in the recovery area for a few days, and he's in the collection to this day. He's one of the cheetahs. This is an American alligator. And one day there was these two American alligators were fighting, and the keepers were watching as one bit the other. Right here, you can see this fracture. So they went, they anesthetized them, they fixed it healed. They had another one who was bit who just wouldn't let the keepers get near him, so they followed him. And we started x-raying alligators, and we found that a lot of them had these chronic fractures with some deformity, but it didn't seem to affect their mobility. So that just might be the way that they function. Here you can see this alligator was pinned. Now this is a Cuban crocodile, and you look at these pieces, these might look familiar to you. These are the two pins from the strap of a wristwatch. And this is the dial and some other pieces. This is a crocodile that swallowed a clock. This is like the story of Peter Pan. Except in the story of Peter Pan, the clock keeps working. And over here, we learn that the crocodiles, somewhere down the line, something compresses that clock and it's fractured. This is a rat snake. And look at the spine. This is chronic osteomyelitis throughout the spine of the snake. Now what happens is this: snakes start at the tail, and they start swallowing the animal and compress what they're swallowing and crush it. And they swallow everything with claws and teeth, and the bowel of the snake is very thick. I brought in, one day we brought in a 6-meter Burmese python to x-ray. I did a mammo on a 6-meter Burmese python, one mammo film at a time. And we CT'd them and we MR'd them. So the bowel of the snake is very, very thick walled, but it's a single tube, and it runs all the way down. Well, sometimes the claw that they swallow, or a shard of bone, actually perforate through the bowel and can cause perforate the spine. Now, the blood and lymphatic drainage along the spine is longitudinal. So when a snake gets osteomyelitis of the spine, it runs up and down the spine. And we have a lot of cases of osteomyelitis of the spine in snakes. You would think that it's something unheard of. Turns out, we've got quite a few cases, over 20 of osteomyelitis of spines of snakes. What's even more interesting is that we have about 5 cases that are not pathologically, clearly not osteomyelitis, but they look like Paget disease of bone. The same Paget disease of bone that we see in humans, where you see the mosaic pattern. And you see that in the spine of the snake. Now, I don't know about any, we haven't found those same, pathologically, those same inclusion bodies that people identified in human Paget disease. And since there's no good biological marker for Paget's, there's no way to say, are these two diseases that look alike, or are these really the same diseases? So here's a mangrove snake with the same problem. Look at this massive bone formation. This is not normal. So this is what the normal spine looks like in this snake, and all of this is osteomyelitis. And a boa constrictor with the same thing. This is not just degenerative. Okay, and I'm going to close with the diamondback. So, one day, I get a call from the chief vet of the zoo. He said, "Come on down." I said, "What happened?" He said, "I'll tell you when you get here." Okay. So I come to the zoo. It's like 3 in the morning. I said, "Okay, what's up?" He said, "Well, yesterday we had an eastern diamondback rattlesnake. This is one of the most poisonous snakes that live in the northeast United States, and they live in the New York area outdoors. This is their comfort zone. And one of them gave birth. There were some eggs that hatched, and there were 5 newborn snakes, and they were in a certain area, all as well. and the keeper who was taking care of them, checked at night, and he saw there were only 4. So now there was a panic. So he said, we need to find the snake. I said, what do you want from me? I said, how do they look? He said, they all look exactly the same. I said, so one didn't swallow the other. He goes, we're not sure of that. I said, what? He said, your job is just to look at the x-rays. So they took all the snakes, they put them all in a sack, they put some anesthetic in the sack, gas, the snakes all passed out. They lined them all up on one x-ray plate and shot the x-ray of all 4. So I have one x-ray film with all 4 snakes on it. I'm looking. I took a magnifying glass, and right behind the head of one snake, I see the outline of the head of another snake, which looks exactly the same, but it's right behind the head. So, and I show him, I said, I think you found your other snake. I said, how does this happen? He said, the snake is so powerful. He said, this guy started with the tail of his brother, and as he swallows, he crushes what's going on. Except the skull is too big to crush, so he can't crush it. So it takes a while until the acids destroy the skull a little and soften it, and then he can crush it down. He said he'll crush it all, so the panic was averted. But we had the same issue about 2 years ago with the zoo, when a poisonous snake did escape. And the zoo was closed for several days, until they found the snake in the basement of some other building, and the vet said it was cold. They said, we know where we're going to find the snake. We're going to find him in a cold, dark, warm area. And they went, they looked with flashlights in cold, dark, warm areas, and they found it. Now, every animal at the zoo has an implanted transponder. So this animal, when there was newborn, he hadn't gotten the transponder yet. But the other animal that had escaped had a transponder. So they said that they couldn't find them with the readers. The zoo has transponder readers all over. So at any time they could look on a screen, they can identify any animal. So they said the only reason they can't see him is he must be in an area where he's shielded from RF. And they said that just means he's in a basement or in a sewer drain or somewhere where the radio frequency signal isn't, they're not getting a read back from his tiny little transponder. They said we just have to get an antenna somewhere where we can read it, and that's what they did. They basically went through and they were poking antennas into various areas and doing RF triggers until they got a read back, and they found him in the basement of one of the buildings, and it took a few days, but for those few days the zoo was closed. They would not allow any visitors so that nobody would get bit by that snake. So I'm going to stop over here, and I thank you very much for the